Hi, so welcome to part 2 of lecture 7, and this we looked at race before, so now we're going to look at ethnicity. Again, same sort of structure, historical and structural and cultural, and building around the notion of sort of the nation state, which is an important concept we'll take up a bit later. So whiteness, the white nation, and ethnicity.
We can think about it at the level of identity. Who counts as a real Australian? How does Australian identity work? Do you identify as an Australian? What does that mean? We can think about it at the level of attitudes, about prejudice and stereotyping. But what we want to focus on, particularly the hardest thing to see, is that those deeper layers, the structure, the way these ideas and attitudes are institutionalised. And Americans call this white privilege, or maybe in Australia it's kind of Anglocentrism. You know, the idea that sort of a British Australian identity is the real one. You don't often hear that term, British Australian. And the other identities are somehow less real. That's just one way of getting yourself into the concept of ethnicity. There's a whole bunch of related terms. Last week we talked about race, and race is about biology, based on presumed biological differences. Usually that's skin colour. You know, the people are biologically different, and right up to the Second World War this was seen as a scientific proposition, like the different racial groups were physically or biologically different, or not quite different species, but almost like a different species. If you went back another 100 years, indigenous people were just seen as primitives and savages, and that was a biological thing, and they were a different race. Ethnicity is more of a modern concept, and because we've critiqued the notion of race, so we often put it in inverted commas because we recognise that it isn't biological, it's a social construct. This complicates the idea of ethnicity a bit then, because we also talk about ethnic groups, and ethnic groups aren't quite the same as racial groups in the sense that ethnic groups are groups that are assumed to have a culture in common. It's a way of thinking about there's a dominant group and the minority group is seen as having a culture, and that explains why there's inequality. So cultural differences are ascribed to cultural groups resident in a given nation state. Now, a nation is a difficult thing to define, precisely because it is contested about what will count as the real Australia or what will count as the real nation. But for our purposes we can say, look, a nation's a stable community of people with a shared history who have a common language, territory, economic life and culture and identity. Now that's not quite as simple as it sounds. When you get that notion of a national group, you can ask yourself, to get some idea of the complexity, you can ask yourself, well, when did Australia become a nation? We celebrate Australia Day on the 26th of January, but the day white settlement occurred, but there was no country called Australia then. It was the colony of New South Wales. And sometimes we say it's at Federation. That's when Australia officially became a federation of states. But some people say, as we've recently had with Anzac, at Anzac Day was the time when Australia was born as a nation. So different ways of thinking about what the nation might be and what that might mean. Now, a nation state, we need to be clear, we often talk about nation states. Now they're slightly different. The nation state is the modern form of social life in capitalist societies. The ideal is seen as a common people with a common culture in a common area and sharing a state apparatus. Very few nation states have undisputed borders like Australia does, because we're a land mass that was only settled by one country. There are separatist movements, like in Ireland, where the Irish nation wants to have its own state separate from Britain. There are nations without states, so the Kurdish people who live in northern Iraq and parts of Turkey are identifiable people, but they don't have their own state. Indigenous people more recently have started to think of themselves as the First Nations. Before the rise of the modern nation state, they could think about their tribal groupings and the relations between them as nations, as identifiable groups of people, And of course then we'd have naturalised citizens, people who come to Australia and become naturalised and sign up and say they'll be citizens of Australia as part of the social contract. The state is the governing apparatus that generally has a monopoly over the legitimate use of force in a given area. Initially we think of police and army, the court system, but it also extends to the welfare state, education, the health system. So it's the thing to grasp is the state's a much bigger thing than the government. We elect governments, and they change every few years, and we elect them at a state level and at a federal level in different parliaments. There's a House of Representatives and a Senate. They're all part of the state, but there's also a big part of the state that's harder to see. So your school system, your health system is mostly state funded. There's courts, there's the army, the legal system, a whole range of things that constitute the state. This university is supported as a state institution or a semi-state institution. So you can think of the nation as the people, or the construct that defines a group as a community, as a people, which shares a common language, descent or history, and the state is all of the apparatus that governs that, and the government is the part that you elect. And there have been nationalist movements that have sought for groups, national groups, to be independent or to have their own state. So the nation state is the ideal in capitalist society. So those movements that aim to get national independence or to form their own state were nationalist movements, and they were social movements, usually of groups that defined themselves as having that common culture and history and land, and having that became defined as the right to self-determination. Now Europeans didn't already had nation states, so this came out of in Australia in the 1870s. People who were born in the landmass of Australia began to feel less and less like they were British, although that identity carried on right through to the First World War. The native-born people here felt themselves to be different from England, and so sought to be independent, and eventually the colonies would federate in 1901. You go around the world, all of those colonial powers, ours was quite early in the 1870s, but then after the war, particularly the British colonial and the French colonial apparatus was challenged by people fighting for the right to self-determination. So after the war, after the Second World War, colonial peoples threw off the colonial powers of Britain, France, to some extent Germany and Spain, and declared that they had the right to determine their own affairs. Now those claims can be made in different ways. I've already mentioned citizenship. You can elect to become a member of a nation state and to be an Australian. You can come here, you can sign Pledge of Allegiance, but traditionally those claims are also made on primordial grounds, that the people who lived in a given area shared a common blood or a common history, and this was often an imaginary thing, that people imagined that they had something in common, and a story or a myth was constructed around the idea of a German people or a French people that was sort of homogenous and shared a whole lot of things in common. That's why there's an overlap between ethnicity and race. There's a couple of overlaps, but this is one of them. The idea that the blood ties or the biology is somehow implicated in the people who lived here, have lived here forever. This is much less strong in Australia, of course, because white settlement's only 200 years old. But in Europe, there's that sense of we've always been here, and so we share this history and this biology in common. More recently, of course, you've had more citizenships and social contracts. All nations are homogenised, meaning they are heterogeneous groups of people who've come together and declared that they have this in common. And often within each nation, there are ethnic groups which are seen as minorities. And these may be constructed in different ways. Often there's prejudice and discrimination, and they're seen as somehow threatening. But all nation states have them. there's Basque people in Spain, and there's different Celtic groups, and there are different groups in France that aren't seen as fully French, not really French. We're just much less aware of them. A lot of countries, like even Germany, didn't really exist as a modern nation state until the 1870s. Of course, Australia didn't exist in 1900. So they pulled together a whole lot of smaller states and eventually called that Germany, and it was homogenised under Prussia as the dominant group that became Germany. China's the same. China's a modern nation state, but it's the dominant ethnicity there is the Han group, but there's lots of different ethnic groups who all regard themselves as Chinese, or are more or less regarded as Chinese by others. So there's a whole series of relationships we need to think about. So nationalism, very powerful force in the world. And you can see this, now we live in a much more global world, these global interactions around ethnicity, and we can see that it's on a continuum. You can see large groups trying to eliminate ethnic groups that are the dominant group, trying to eliminate ethnic groups that they see as a threat, or to create a racially pure nation. You must eliminate those who are not seen as being of the correct ethnicity. So of course we think of Jews in Germany, genocides in Rwanda, there have been attacks on Armenians. I think this diagram is kind of using Indigenous Australia's move to reserves as population transfer. So you try to concentrate the population in a given spot. And we raised the question last week about genocide in relation to Indigenous people. Indigenous people are sort of new kind of, we don't treat them, notice they're a racial group, so how do we treat in terms of the state apparatus? There's a Department for Indigenous Affairs, and there's a Department for Ethnic Affairs. So even though there's a lot of overlap, in the terms of the state and the management of those issues, they're seen as quite separate. So Indigenous people don't see themselves as an ethnic group because they are making claims to have always been here, whereas ethnic groups are groups who've moved to Australia. But again, the dominant group is the white group that moved here 200 years ago, and the minority groups are other non-British ethnicities. You can have all of these applied to Indigenous people, in my view. Certainly at the turn of the century, it was understood that black people were dying out. There have been transfers of populations to missions, internal colonialism, so in a lot of ways we can see the welfare system was used against Indigenous people who were given low paid or menial work. We don't have large enough ethnic, that certainly happened to Indigenous people. In terms of ethnic minorities, we don't have an internal colony so much in relation to ethnic groups, but they were certainly assigned low paid menial work. We don't recognise their qualifications. They came here after the war to do that shit work, essentially. This forms of segregation, say the blacks in the south. This happens in Australia unofficially around black people until quite recently. The freedom rides I mentioned last week in the US and Australia challenged some of that, but we still have Chinatown areas that are seen as specific ethnic enclaves. The fear that creates. It's not seen as segregation, of course. It's seen as them clubbing together rather than us segregating them. Assimilation's been the dominant frame for Australia since Federation. That we expect that minority groups will eventually disappear and will all become Australians. And then more recently we've seen multiculturalism or pluralism, and I think it's important to distinguish here between multiculturalism in practice. In practice, Australia is a multicultural society. There are many people here with many different cultures. So just at a descriptive level, that's an established fact. Multiculturalism as a policy and how the government is going to manage that is another separate set of questions, but I think it's important to distinguish between those two things. We did talk about in the earlier lectures about country of origin and this impression that's been created that the ethnic composition of Australia is changing and there's more people here from Asia in particular. And of course there is some truth to that. There's been changes in the composition, but if you look at country of birth, I've got the more recent statistics, about a quarter of the population of Australia was born overseas. But when you look at the ethnic composition of those groups, it's still overwhelmingly the United Kingdom, British, Irish, Scottish. Then New Zealand. Now that's a difficult one because people use New Zealand as an entry point, but most of those would be British, white Australians from the United Kingdom. Others, New Zealanders, and then there'll be some Indigenous New Zealanders, and then there might be other groups, whatever the ethnic composition of New Zealand is. The Chinese are increasingly a large number here, but still, a fifth of the United Kingdom. Indians, and you can see there's been a change. There's more Indians coming. There's more. The Italians, the Vietnamese, the Filipinos are sort of new, more South Africans, and so on. But, in terms of that quarter of the population, you're still talking about overwhelmingly white identities. Now, as I said with the previous lecture on race, we can bring the sociological imagination to this, and we need to look at the history to be clear about this, and we could spend 12 weeks studying the history of immigration to Australia, and I would recommend that you have a look at SBS's series there. We can look at this immigration nation, then the structure. We look at the structure that was in the previous lecture early in the first half of term, and the text will outlay some of that structure, and I just mentioned one there. We need to think about the culture. What are the ideas, norms and values around immigration, around ethnicity in Australia? We have this phrase, I'm not a racist, but think about that. And I think the important thing to see is the way the culture creates identities, and to see that in that broader history and structure. Now, identity, though, is premised not on just simply on how you identify yourself, but on what you see as the other, and that changes over time. I'll try to show that by looking at the history, the way in which identity is defined by who is not a real Australian. So, of course, colonial immigration begins in Australia in 1788 with the arrival of the first fleet of white settlers. Again, this overlap between race and ethnicity. There was probably about 500,000 natives and hundreds of different tribal groups, or as we've discussed, people or nations, you might think of them that way. That's 1,000 white settlers and 500,000 natives. Predominantly that those people would have seen themselves as part of a British civilization or British Empire. Now again, we get that homogenising effect. Britain, the United Kingdom, includes Irish, Scottish and English people, and they have different religious beliefs. The Irish have had a long struggle to be independent and separate from England, but they would have identified as being part of a common civilization against the primitives and savages that lived here, who were another race in need of civilization, and who were really part of the flora and fauna of the country, the native flora and fauna of the country. By 1868, which is the end of transportation of convicts to Australia, 160,000 people had come, about an average of 20,000 a year assisted migrants. And again, you'd have an identity there between convicts and free settlers rather, and then the children of convicts growing up as free people, and the development of something as a distinctly Australian culture. This is the argument, at any rate. In the 1850s, we had the gold rushes, again largely British people coming out here, to pan for gold and make a fortune, British and Irish. Again, and we have the stories of the Chinese with the race riots that occurred around in different parts of Australia, down at Young and places like that, where the Chinese was seen as foreigners and a threat to British identity. So in that case, you had this Chinese marginalisation. There were no passports and visas and things like that. People just travelled quite freely in the 19th century. It wasn't seen as a need to police borders in that way. But again, we have the white Australian versus the Chinese, and the beginning of that sense of an Australian identity as white and separate from China and part of a different empire too. I mentioned nationalism, and that really started in Australia in the 1870s, with the construction of a colonial Australian identity. So we're still a British colony, but there's a sense that people born here have a distinct identity. They're not really British. And for a long time, Australia was seen as a massive egalitarian social experiment. There wasn't any aristocratic class structures like they had in England. So there was no king and no landed gentry, and so it was seen as an egalitarian society, and was seen as something new, and it was a workers' paradise, and seen as a place where a whole new society could emerge. But that was tempered by the notion that it was a white nation, was part of the British Empire, and even as late as the Anzac legend that we were talking about on Moodle. Anzacs fought as AIF, the second AIF, Australian Imperial Force, so British Empire troops. There's been a long-standing fear of invasion from the north, a small enclave of white people in a vast ocean of Asians who were regarded with suspicion or as regarded as a threat. And indeed, even slavery was seen, that if you had too many dark-skinned people in the population, South Sea Islanders had been kidnapped from the islands and came to work in the sugar fields because that was appropriate work for native people and not for white people. They thought it would lead to a degeneration of the race if white people were to work in the tropics. But in order to have a white nation, then you needed to expel those groups of people. You needed to show that indigenous people were really the same as white people and could be assimilated. And the South Sea Islander people needed to be sent home, and that's what happened. Thousands of them were expelled from Australia. Indeed, this notion of a white Australia was so important that the first act of the Federal Parliament was the Immigration Restricted Act, which excluded Asians. And it did that not by making a rule that excluded Asians, but by having a dictation test in any European language, so that could be easily used then to restrict the people you didn't want, and to make exceptions for the people who you did for other reasons. And so that there are famous cases of someone given a test in any European language, so you could speak 5 languages, but if we didn't want you, then we could find a language you couldn't speak, and tests were given in Gaelic and stuff like that. You might think about how this relates to the recent rise in testing for Australian values in more recent times. So the assumption then, the next sort of big wave of immigration in Australia was in the post-war boom. Lots of refugees and displaced people in Europe looking for work, looking for refuge, and Australia feeling that they were a small white enclave in a big ocean of Asian nations that they needed to have a larger population, and so there was the notion of populate or perish. In the end, about 1,010,000 POMs were imported to Australia, and that was then extended to other groups, Italians, Greeks and Yugoslavs. They were thought of as new Australians. They were eventually seen as sufficiently white to assimilate to the dominant culture and to eventually think of themselves as Australian and to leave their Italian, Greek and Yugoslav culture behind. And it would eventually assimilate to a sort of dominant Anglo culture, but it wasn't really articulated in that form. I'm naming the dominant culture as Anglo to make that distinction. So there's the dominant white Anglo-Saxon culture and the new Australians who are expected to assimilate, to learn English and become Australians. This changed in the 1970s. It was decided that the people didn't need to leave behind their ethnicity when they arrived, and that a better way to deal with the larger number of ethnic groups in Australia wasn't to try to homogenise them, which wasn't happening anyway, of course, but to give them a say, to give up our idea of being a white settler colony and a pure free-born British people in an ocean of Asia, and to say that we're a land of many cultures. And so we started to talk about Greek Australians, Italian Australians. But even that, of course, in a certain sense marks out the notion that there's a real Australian in there, as opposed to a Greek Australian, Italian Australian, and that's the sort of hidden other. You don't see those things. I went to my son's multicultural evening at school, and there's some strange ones in there, Americans dressing as Native Americans, which is kind of a bit odd, and people bringing their different ethnic backgrounds to the table, but nobody dressed up as a British Australian or a English Australian. I mean, those were they're the sort of silent. They're not one group at the table. They are the dominant group. It's other people who have ethnicity, same as it's other people who have gender. Women have a gender. Italians have an ethnicity. Aboriginal people have a race. So it's always the other that those things are projected onto. But this was a massive, massive change in the mindset of Australia in the early 70s to stop thinking of itself, or try to stop thinking of itself as a white colony in the ocean of Asia, and to move away from that British Australian way of thinking, Anglo-Australian way of thinking, and to become modern multicultural society, and to recognise the reality of that. And that required putting money into English language classes. Ethnic community councils were set up to give voice to the concerns of different communities. There was a focus on equal opportunity and acceptance of diversity as an asset rather than a threat. And this policy was political consensus ran on that for 30 years, from the 1970s through to the conservative reaction that we'll talk about in the next lecture. Okay, so in part 2 we got to that change in a multicultural policy, and that was merely part of accepting of the reality of Australia. And there's been a lot of changes since the 1970s, both good and bad, of course. The rise of neoliberal globalisation in the 21st century in particular, but towards the end of last century and the beginning of this one. And there were a lot of changes, but I mean, globalisation is about the movement of, well, money especially, but people. So we're in a more globalised world, we're more aware of others, both as threats and as potential allies, I guess. The greater interconnection of the world brings people closer together for good reasons and for bad ones. And that multicultural policy is a necessary reflection of those changes and the movements of people. But the downside of that has been an increasing privatisation of government services, particularly in healthcare and education, a reduction in tax on business, a reduction in power of the unions. So the way Australia was run as a society, with a certain amount of tariff protection, a certain level of wages that reflected that, then full employment as a norm, was undone in the 21st century, or late part of that century, from the 1980s onward. And although attempts were made to try to not politicise issues around multiculturalism in Australia, which of course can be potentially very dangerous in a society that's multicultural, multicultural in the physical sense, in the sense of that's the reality of it, whatever policy you run about that. And what has occurred, in my view, is a relicensing of racism and the channeling of a large amount of the dissent that people feel about these changes around globalisation, about the lack of security, lack of job security, about the lack of representation, get channeled towards ethnic minorities. So we can trace the change in this reaction with the election of the Conservative government in 1996. What had been, there had certainly been, say, refugees prior to that, after the Vietnam War, and there was indeed mandatory detention set up by the Keating government, but there was bipartisan support for that issue, and there were great efforts made to ensure that those issues weren't politicised and that there was a political consensus around that. But by 1996 there were changes in society, the election of a new Conservative government. I mentioned the move against land rights, and the Northern Territory intervention came a little bit later, but it was part of that move against the progress that had been made in Indigenous affairs. John Howard, I used 1996 because that the year John Howard's Conservative government got elected. Probably the most overtly racialised speech in an Australian Parliament for many, many years happened in 1996 with Pauline Hanson. She said that Australia was being swamped by Asians. This recalls a rhetoric, from the 1950s or even before, that Australia was a wide enclave in an ocean of Asians, and we needed to be afraid of that, and lest they invade. And of course that was reinforced by the Japanese coming so far south in the Second World War, although recent history would tell you that they had no intention of invading Australia. Nevertheless, we were at war with them, so there was that fear of invasion that had pre-existed that for a long time. This notion that Australia is an empty country and that our neighbours to the north are eyeing off that huge space and want to move there. One Nation formed as a party in 1997 and became Pauline Hanson's One Nation. Now, I'll put a question mark there just to flag One Nation. So what are we talking about when we talk about One Nation? What is the assumption there about who's going to be in the One Nation? If we're not One Nation now, what are we, and why do we need a party that promotes the idea of One Nation? And again, I think you can see that there's this fear of the other, which the famous "please explain" line comes from that question of xenophobia, the fear of the other, particularly Asians. We need to be one nation, one presumably white nation. Now, in 1998, this was sufficiently popular, and the discontent that was being felt by a whole range of issues was channeled into this dissent. I think you can see it more recently too with Bob Katter's party, Australia Party, similar, different rhetoric from Pauline Hanson, but nevertheless that it taps into this discontent and this the previous vision of Australia. So she was able to win 25% of the vote in 1988 and a large number of seats in the Queensland State Parliament. Now that's particularly Queensland phenomena. Like I said, we can see it more recently in Bob Katter's Australia Party. So similar, drawing on a similar set of ideas. And then in August 2001, we had the Tampa affair, which was the first clear effort by a government to begin politicising the issue of refugees. Tampa was a New Zealand, a Norwegian freighter that had picked up a refugee ship and had requested permission to drop them at Christmas Island and was refused. In fact, the ship was boarded by Australian troops in an effort to stop refugees coming to Australia. And that was sort of the beginning of a process of seeing refugees, that is to say refugees who arrive by boat, the vast majority of refugees arrive by plane, as a threat, and I'll do some analysis of this in a minute, but that was sort of the beginning of that period where we see so clearly in Australian politics now the issue of refugees as a political issue. And I want to take this chance to use this issue to talk about some ways of doing analysis, and so rather than just outline all the various things that have happened, I'll leave you to educate yourself about the reality of refugees. So I wanted to look at media framing and the way issues and stories are framed. Now, we need to become more aware when we look at the media that the way we present information and make sense of what are very complex issues is done in ways that reduces the complexity. It has to be reduced to a soundbite. Anyone who has ever done any work with the media realises that if you want to make a statement to the media, you need it in 5 or 10 second sound bites, and that's, if you get 15 or 20 seconds in a news story, then you're doing well. So you want that story, and you have to tell a story that the media understands. So it can't be complicated. To understand, for instance, what is happening in Israel and Palestine, you need a knowledge of history, and that takes time to explain. But you're not going to get 25 minutes, half an hour to explain the history. You're going to get 25 seconds. So what happens in the media and in the news is a familiar, repetitive storyline. So if I said that a Muslim leader was a terrorist, say Hezbollah or a terrorist organisation, that's a familiar story. You've heard that before. You don't question it. If I said President Obama was a terrorist, that's not a familiar storyline, and you would naturally expect me to provide evidence and argument for that story, rightly so. But I'm not going to get a lot of time in the media to give you that evidence and argument. And indeed, I think in many respects, public culture in Australia has become so familiar with this media framing, or so dumbed down, as the expression goes, that the need to explain something almost disqualifies you from having a good story to tell. There's all sorts of framing devices, metaphors, catchphrases, visual images, and these are accompanied by reasoning devices that include the cause of events, consequences, and appeals to stereotypes. So that's the other thing you really need in media framing, is a stereotype, so that I don't have to. It conveys a lot of necessarily inaccurate information quickly, and even at the level of what will count as the news and what will count as entertaining. If you sit down tonight and watch the news, look at the lead story. It purports to be world news, some kind. Look at a national news story, and there will be half a dozen stories in that news bulletin. Ask yourself why it got chosen. Out of the population of 23 million people in Australia who did all sorts of things today, why did these 6 or 7 items get chosen? And do they really reflect the most important things that have happened in Australia, or let alone the world? Why did they get selected, and on what basis? But what I want to specifically look at in this section is a specific incident that occurred, and just to reinforce the idea, particularly visual images are very powerful to human beings, and we have a very, very poor understanding of how meaning is constructed out of images, video images or photographic images. And it's important that you understand the way in which the frame, it tells you how to explain a photograph. And to understand that, you need to understand how the meaning's produced. And often it's what's left out of the frame that's important. So you can't see the history because you're not being told that, you've just got a picture. So you always need to always try to ask yourself, what am I not being told here? Photos don't speak for themselves. in October 2001, there was a famous incident this was in the lead up to the election in that year, and it was called the Children Overboard scandal. And so I wanted to use that as an example of framing, and to continue the discussion of the conservative backlash and whether we can't make an argument that in a strange way we're not heading back to a kind of white earlier conception of Australia as a white colony, or not a colony, a white nation that has barriers against immigration and fear of others, a different set of relationships to others than multiculturalism. This is the famous picture that did the rounds of the media. It was reported by the Howard government that Australian troops had been forced to rescue children from the ocean. And that, of course, sets up the question of what sort of people would throw their children into the ocean in order to come to Australia. I mean, are they sort of people that we want here, and so on? They would have to be cunning and ruthless people who, want to manipulate our better nature. That we that we're the good guys, and so naturally we'd dive in and save their children. And if we do that, then we'd have to accept them as refugees. So it's manipulative. And so we have a sense of ourselves as the good rescuers being exploited by a bad other. So what does that picture say about refugees? But that's not in the picture, is it? In fact, if I hadn't told you, you wouldn't know, what that was even a picture of. It relies on stereotypes of ethnic others, particularly Muslims. They're illegal. They're queue jumpers. They're a threat to our security. We need to detain them. They're imposing themselves on us. It's going to be expensive. There's an issue with border security. They're a threat. So all of those things come, are brought into the frame for that picture. But let's think about a competing framework. Here's the full picture. The bit you saw is down in the bottom left-hand corner. And what you can see here is a completely different picture, isn't it? In the foreground is the Australian Army Navy boat, and the refugee boat that's clearly, sinking, which wasn't in the original picture. So now what are we talking about? Now we know that their boat was sinking, so they're a desperate bunch of people. They need our help. They're refugees or asylum seekers. They are the victims. We should know now that the government lied about what was happening. That detention is, in many respects, illegal. It's a human right to seek asylum in a country. And that we should help. That, we are the good guys, and they're also the good guys. And so there's a good self and a good other, and an act of international rescue and recognising our international rights and so on. So again, ask yourself how racial and ethnic stereotypes are implicated around about the same time as this around-the-world yachtsmen, who of course are good white people, got lost in the Antarctic, as that's the shortest way to do around-the-world navigation, is to go around the Arctic Circle, and they had to be rescued. A plane was sent out to rescue them, but there was no question that this was our responsibility to rescue people in trouble. It was a Mayday call. It's a set of international laws that we respond to people in trouble at sea, and that it cost a lot of money. There's just one person who was essentially engaging in a leisure activity, a very wealthy individual. But there was no question there of whether or not, I'm not suggesting we shouldn't have rescued them, but think about how ethnic and racial stereotypes are implicated in how we understand those stories. Now, framing isn't really a question of whether the facts are accurate. All facts have to be framed. It's a matter of which facts are presented and how they're presented. So it turns out that the problem is that even when the government's facts are shown to be a fabrication, most people still accept the frame that people are illegal. So that's an important recognition. There's lots of consequences of this way of framing it, and we've seen it go on and on and on since this time. It'll be an issue in Australian politics for a long time. the perpetuation of myths. Many people staying. The legal people who are illegally in Australia are people who overstay their visas, and they're British and German backpackers for the most part, American backpackers. But no one is suggesting we should round them all up and put them in concentration camps. Policy of mandatory detention is very unusual in the world. Most people are subject to mandatory health and criminal checks and then released. Most of these people will eventually be accepted as refugees, 85% or more. It's an enormous cost to the taxpayer. It further traumatises people who are already subject to a great deal of trauma. It's about the government politicising the issue in a way that helps them win elections. It certainly did in 2001. And like I say, there's a range of possible options that could be put forward. You could have initial detention and then open detention where people are allowed to come and go with some sort of curfew. Many countries in the world have a community release system. You're required to report in. The majority in New Zealand, for instance, the majority of asylum seekers are housed with community-based accommodation, and they find a job and begin to deal with their issues and become members of the community. And again, this particular issue exists around people coming on boats, which I think buys into a very long-standing fear of Australia of invasion from the north. The vast majority of refugees, of course, arrive by plane, but they don't seem to be such an issue. That there are no such thing as illegal people in the world. I think that's an important. People have a right under international law to seek asylum in a third country. Asylum seekers in Australia face mandatory detention, unlike the majority of illegal immigrants. There's no right to permanent asylum. There's become a discourse of queue jumping, and it's currently illegal for the Human Rights Commission to approach them and inform them of their rights. Camp conditions are considered by the UN and Amnesty as very poor, and there's been recent controversy about that again with the new setup on Manus Island. All this, of course, continued by the Labor government after Howard was defeated in the election in 2007. You're talking about tiny numbers of people, really, a few thousand. And again, it's another way of racial stereotypes being used to deflect people. I recommend that you go to the Refugee Council website, work your way through their fact sheets. You need to be clear about this issue. It's going to be an ongoing one, and it causes a great deal of unnecessary controversy. It's a very expensive policy, and in my view, a very unnecessary one. But I just could refer you to the Refugee Council to get your facts straight before we start having a discussion. This is sort of, again, getting back to the theme of the lecture. What are these images? These are images from the Cronulla riots. Now, these happened down on the beaches of Cronulla and south of Sydney. They were a product of a great deal of inciting racial hatred by popular radio announcers like Alan Jones. And again, there's this notion of defending the beaches of Australia from others. Of course, Muslims in this was the case. But again, we've got these images. What images of Australia are we talking about here? What do these flags represent? So under the guise of patriotism and nationalism, there lies an aggressive assertion of a white nationalist identity. Is it racist? I'll leave that for you to discuss. I think they're complicated. And again, if you think of the self and the other, who was the self, who was the real Australian here, who were the others? Clearly Lebs. Lebs is sort of, slang term for all Arabs, I guess. So I guess the take home, if we come back to those issues of identity, we can look at the structure and the culture, and we've looked at the history, but we can talk now about what an Australian identity would look like. But identities are constructed. They vary over time and place. People have multiple identities. It's defined in relation to others. There might be legal definitions of being Australian. You can be a citizen, but that doesn't necessarily entitle you to all the same privileges that I mean, they may be legally recognised as equal without that necessarily resulting in being socially equal. There's your birthplace counts. You'll see people assert their, I'm a sixth or seventh generation Australian as a way of establishing a kind of authenticity around identity. It might be your ethnicity or your race. Do Indigenous people count as real Australians, given that they were here long before white people? We have this discourse about something being un-Australian. What exactly does that mean? What would it take for a Muslim to be accepted as part of Australian identity? How would that work? And in what ways, what changes would need to occur? So I'll leave you to think about that. But I think, in a broader sense, while we're doing media analysis, I think it's tied up to a whole lot of global issues, and I think it helps to look at it in the broader sense, apart from Australia's particular cultural characteristics, about building a culture of fear, that the media builds a culture of fear, and this has been a sociological idea that has been developed. There's a fear of terrorism, that there's these others that are evil, that the world is divided into good people and evil people, and that we are of course the good people, and that the only appropriate response to those situations is to react with violence. Culture of fear creates, I've mentioned this in relation to violence in the media, that people fear being victims of violence. They don't, the concern about violence on television isn't really about whether or not we're encouraging people to become criminals. It creates a fear, and a fear of others. There's a nice interview here, with if you have a chance to watch Mike Moore's excellent video. He talks about the culture of fear in Bowling for Columbine, his excellent documentary about the Columbine massacres, and just before I play it, this is Marilyn Manson, the punk rocker. Maybe that's not the right term, but shock rocker, and he was blamed for the Columbine massacre. In some sense, it was his music that was seen, because they listened to that music, so he was seen as somehow responsible. And so Mike Moore went to interview him. And before you watch this, just have a think about, well, what do you think he's going to say? And and again, he sets up an interesting frame here. And this is a way of framing a question. Is it me or the president, as he says? Who's got a bigger influence in what's going on? And he makes some nice points about a campaign of fear and consumption. So I'll just play that video.
Answer.
Angry, heavy metal subculture. Where were the parents?
Violent movies.
South Park.
Video games.
Television.
Entertainment.
Satan.
Cartoons. Doom.
Society.
Toy guns. Drugs.
Shock rocker. Marilyn Manson.
Marilyn Manson.
Marilyn Manson.
Marilyn Manson.
Marilyn Manson.
Marilyn Manson has canceled the last 5 dates of his U.S. tour out of respect for those lost in Littleton. But the singer says artists like himself are not the ones to blame.
This is perhaps the sickest group ever promoted by a mainstream record company.
After Columbine, it seemed that the entire focus on why the shootings occurred was because the killers listened to Marilyn Manson. 2 years after Columbine, Manson finally returned to Denver.
The Ozfest at Mile High Stadium brings shock rocker Marilyn Manson to Denver tomorrow.
There were protests from the religious right. But I thought I'd go and talk with him myself.
When I was a kid growing up, music was the escape. That's the only thing that had no judgments. You put on a record and it's not going to yell at you for dressing the way you do. It's going to make you feel better about it.
Some will be so brash to ask if we believe that all who hear Manson tomorrow night will go out and commit violent acts. The answer is no. But does everybody who watches a Lexus ad go and buy a Lexus? No, but a few do.
I definitely can see why they would pick me, because I think it's easy to throw my face on a TV, because I'm, in the end, sort of a poster boy for fear. Because I represent what everyone's afraid of, because I do and say what I want.
If Marilyn Manson can walk into our town and promote hate, violence, suicide, death, drug use and Columbine-like behavior, I can say, not without a fight you can't.
The two byproducts of that whole tragedy were violence and entertainment and gun control. And how perfect that was the two things that we were going to talk about with the upcoming election. And also then we forgot about Monica Lewinsky, and we forgot about the president was shooting bombs overseas, yet I'm a bad guy because I've sang some rock and roll songs. And who's a bigger influence, the president or Marilyn Manson?
Do you know,
I'd like to think me, but I'm going to go with the president.
do you know that the day that Columbine happened, the United States dropped more bombs on Kosovo than any other time during that war?
I do know that, and I think that that's really ironic, you know, that nobody said, well, maybe the president had an influence on this violent behavior. No, because that's not the way the media wants to take it and spin and turn it into fear, because then you're watching television, you're watching the news, you're being pumped full of fear. There's floods, there's AIDS, there's murder. Cut to commercial. Buy the Acura, buy the Colgate. If you have bad breath, they're not going to talk to you. If you got pimples, the girl's not going to fuck you. And it's just this, it's a campaign of fear and consumption. And that's what I think that it's all based on, is the whole idea that keep everyone afraid and they'll consume. Mm-hmm. And that's really as simple as it can be boiled down to.
Right. If you were to talk directly to the kids at Columbine or the people in that community, what would you say to them if they were here right now?
I wouldn't say a single word to them. I would listen to what they have to say, and that's what no one did.
And more broadly, when we think more broadly of those changes in economic policy that I mentioned, broadly called neoliberalism or economic rationalism. Neoliberalism is the dominant economic policy settings in Australia. And Naomi Klein, the well-known analyst, has looked at these policies were adopted, and she argues that what happened is that, that to introduce them you have to create a crisis. The crisis is formed, and then the shocked population is prepared to accept any remedy.
What I'm trying to do in the shock doctrine is tell how capitalism unrestrained came to dominate the world. We are witnessing a transfer of wealth of unfathomable size. These radical policies have needed shocks, they have needed crises, they have needed states of emergency. Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. So much is at stake. If we want responses to this crisis that leave us with a world that is healthier, that is more just, that is more peaceful, we are going to have to go out there and make them do it.
So there's some stuff online there around her idea of the shock doctrine, and you can have a look at the summary there as well. Now, of course, we could go on about globalisation and the media. We could do a course on this ourselves, but there's a few more for you to look at around the media, and I'd recommend that Immigration Nation in particular.